gosh, look at the crowd.
Come this way.
Those who spread goodness radiate happiness to everyone around them. Introducing LOLC Finance Credit Cards. Fuel the goodness in you.
Good evening. This is LMDtv and I'm Fazmina Imamudeen. Joining with us is Hasitha Premaratne. Hasitha, it is good to have you with us tonight.
Same here. Thanks for having me in the show.
What's your big picture take on the 2022 interim budget proposals? Could you cite two pros and cons?
Yeah, I think this is an interim budget, first of all, and obviously it attempts to bring more realistic nature into the previously presented 2022 budget, which was presented into November 2021, which obviously is now outdated, and most of the things that have been looked at in the context of the budget reading last year has changed economically. So naturally, this budget attempts to make changes into the both in revenue streams as well as the expenditure streams to make it more current and relevant to the current context of the economy and where we are. Now we're talking about the positive side of things. I think, as I said before, it attempts to make things more realistic from where it was earlier. Obviously, the tax proposals attempting to increase the tax revenue on one side, while on the other side, a diversion of the some of the expense categories to support the current requirement, including how the current interest rates impact the interest cost of the government coffers. So on the other side, also, I think the critical part that comes with it is a bit of additional allocation towards welfare. Given the current status of the economy, where people are suffering with the cost of living increase in a big way, naturally the lower income brackets are the most impacted by the inflation. So the government attempts to allocate certain amount of additional funds to support that lower income brackets, which otherwise would suffer due to the inflationary pressures in the country. So I think it's a positive thing. Normally, a welfare allocation will be seen as a negative thing, but from economic perspective. But then in this case, I think, practically speaking, I think it's something that is needed at this stage, which otherwise would have led to bigger challenges in the wider socio-economy. But on the other side, I think on negative front, if we look at some of the challenges and issues here, one is there is an allocation of a large portion of the public investment side in terms of investment, but then this is not necessarily looked at from a growth perspective. So economic growth will be curtailed big time, and that's probably understood in the current context of things that in terms of the state of the economy and where we are. So this is not a growth budget. It doesn't really give proposals to grow the economy in a bigger way in the short term, but it more addresses the short term issues that are there. And more importantly, I think the other aspect is that there are significant changes to the tax regime, be it the individual income tax, be it the corporate tax, be it the indirect taxes. So those significant changes to be implemented in a short period of time, particularly for the inland revenue to adjust themselves, their technology, the remis systems, and the tax administration aspect to be brought in a short period of time to accommodate these changes might be quite challenging. So I don't know whether those aspects were thought through adequately when this was done. But some of these changes obviously need the hour, because it's to pull us out of the current situation in the economy. But having said that, administratively there are certain challenges to adopt to these changes fast, because it's about a kind of a complete change in the regime, tax regime, compared to what it was in the last 2.5 years.
How will the recently concluded staff level agreement with the IMF affect these proposals? Will we see more tax increases when the 2023 budget is presented in November?
Not really. I think the budget interim budget predominantly covers bulk of the agreements that were set in that staff level agreement with IMF, and those proposals are mostly articulated in the interim budget. So my take here is that the staff level agreement was just announced a couple of days after. That agreement to sign the staff level agreement was announced just a couple of days after reading the budget, which means authorities did have the access to all that information and what's coming in the staff level agreement. So the budget attempts to get a start to implement some of those proposals in the staff level agreement is what I see, and then that's kind of the base that is kind of coming in terms of the principles. It's very clear that the fiscal deficit to be addressed. So in the short run, tax rate increases to be brought in, and certain expenditure allocations to be taken in as well. And in the meantime, it attempts to look at certain reforms that need to be brought in the broader economy to ensure that the government coffers won't get kind of pressurized to fund some of the state-owned enterprises. So some of these aspects are being spoken about, which clearly indicates that this is a platform set to get on with the IMF staff level agreement and the proposals in it. So in that context, to be specific to your next question, I think the 2023 budget, which should be ideally read in 2022 November, should not make significant changes to the tax rates and the regime that is talking about. Probably it might elaborate things further and look at how we need to take this forward to the next year.
Is enough being done to protect the poor, and are there sufficient exemptions on indirect taxes on essential items?
That's a big challenge that the country is facing today. That is what we have seen in the last 6 to 8 months, is that there was money in hand with the people, but there was no goods to buy, right? So there was a shortage, and that impacted the whole economy top to bottom, because when there are no goods to buy, whether be or the rich or the middle caste or the lower end of the pyramid, it doesn't matter where you stand in the society in terms of income group, you don't have the goods. So that's probably what we saw the last 6 months. But the next 6 months looks like it's going to be the opposite of that, which means there will be goods, but then there'll be no money to buy, right? No cash to buy. So that will impact most to the bottom part of the pyramid, which is the lower income groups. Most, of course, not to say that the middle and the other groups are not impacted, they will be, but the most will be the lower middle class income group and the lower income group. So those categories need to be supported in an environment like this, because where the inflation is going at nearly 100% or 90% on food inflation, and average inflation is about 60% level, naturally there has to be support given through the budget. And we have seen that certain allowances and allocations have been given, particularly with the welfare side of things. How exactly these will be passed on is not very clear, but then having said that, there is allocation and looks like it's on the cards. So that's something that I think is essential, and that's covered to an extent, though it may not necessarily be covered to the extent that one would like. Having said that, I think also it's important to understand the indirect impact of some of these tax changes, particularly the indirect taxes, the value-added taxes, and the social security levy that's been introduced, which actually came with the previous budget as well. But these will naturally make the goods in general expensive to everybody, not to the high income groups only, but it will apply to the low income groups as well. And when you talk about the essential items, there aren't too many exemptions that are being spoken about, and generally the IMF program behind us and just about on the corner. Naturally, you can't read a budget with too many reliefs as well. So I think it'll be a challenging time for the lower income groups and the lower middle income groups in the next maybe 6 to 12 months. While budget attempts to do something about it, whether it's adequate or not is a big question.
How do you think the business community will view the increase in the corporate tax rate?
Yeah, I think the corporate tax regime has been on a roller coaster ride, as you have seen in the last maybe 10 years. If you take, we had different types of tax rates coming in. One regime reduces, then it increased in 2016-17 time period, and then again it reduced in 2020 onwards, and then now again it's going up. So what corporate tax does is it obviously takes from 24 to 30% for most companies. What that increase or whatever these changes does is it gives inconsistency to the businesses when they are going on planning and budgeting. And that's something that I know business likes. Obviously, what you like, what you want to see is consistency. It's not about whether tax rate is high or low, but it's the consistency that matters most, because then you can plan yourself when you talk about investment decisions or any other business decisions that are being taken. So in that context, if you look at the last 10 years, I think it's been a real roller coaster ride where it goes up, down, and too many changes into little time. So I think that will not be appreciated. But having said that, I think the business community understands that the current situation the country is in, where the government's budget deficit is too wide to live with, which means you'll have to increase the taxes in some form or the other. And in that light, I think the increase is not the real question. I think that's supported, I think, by the business community as well, because it was at a time read as a too low tax regime that was applicable before. But having said that, what is important now, at least, is going forward to build that consistency and give a framework that enables businesses to plan themselves in the long term with the tax structures.
Personal income tax rates are to be increased drastically, with the highest rate to go up by 14% to 32%, and the tax relief thresholds also to be reduced. How do you view this, given the skyrocketing cost of living?
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging time, to be honest, because we've seen the tax regime in, again, like what I said, like the corporate taxes, the income taxes also started to move around quite a bit in the last 10 years, particularly in the 2016 time, it went back to 24%, and then the higher bracket I'm talking about, and then it came down to 18% with the brackets expanded significantly, so that the tax-free allowances and the lower tax rates applicable to a larger part of your income, which brought the income tax from an individual paid to the government to a relatively lower level, probably lower than what it ideally should be in the last couple of years. And then from there, now it goes into a reverse gear, where you're taking the higher rate from 18 to 32 with slabs of 4%, and obviously the cap in each of those slabs being narrowed as well. So that means you're going to pay more taxes, and at certain levels of the income brackets, you probably will have double of your taxes what you pay in September 2022 versus when this new tax comes into effect in October 2022, it will double. Right, in certain low areas as well, there will be a clear increase. So I think the increase was inevitable because it was probably at a too low base. But having said that, issue is it's a double whammy, because like you said, there is a significant pressure on the cost of living because of the high inflationary conditions in the country. And that's not going to help at all when it comes to the savings, or when it comes to the disposable income of the individuals, where the consumption will become a challenge. Because when you talk about somebody having say 100,000 rupee income, already I think with the inflation about half of that is gone, right? You're down to 50% because of inflation. The goods have gone up, and what you can buy for 100,000 last year, probably now you need 200,000 to buy, right? To 200,000 income to buy. And in that, and then your taxes have come in as well, and it has increased both the direct and indirect taxes, which has eaten to a larger portion of your balance income. So that means naturally your disposable income as individual has come down drastically, will come down drastically. So that's when, as I said before, that the people will find it difficult to buy the goods. Now you'll have a regime where you have goods are available, but you may not have the money to buy, and you will have to kind of bring down your spending in different multiple forms, and probably prioritize things at least for a period of time. And I think the government could look at kind of a period of time for these high tax rates to continue, and then look at after a while how they can bring that to a decent level, at least to the levels that it was before, what it was before in 2019 or before 2019. So that to that, I think that approach and the short-term implication is something that will impact the consumption of the economy at large, and also the individuals who will struggle quite a bit due to these tax increases.
Is enough being done to address tax evasion in your view?
This is a tough one. You see, I don't think this interim budget has done too much to cover that aspect, because there is more to do naturally in that context, and particularly when you talk about widening the tax net and ensuring that all taxpayers are tracked properly in terms of their incomes, and how probably that need to be taken into a bigger context. Now the challenge is that these type of things will require a lot to do with technology, which means you need to have digital platforms to be brought in to track the income and connect the systems to the Indian Revenue's famous RAMIS system. And even the operation of the RAMIS system at the moment has a lot of challenges, as we have heard. So it's important that the technology is being used to track and administer the taxes, and maybe the November 2022 budget will elaborate further on how some of those measures that need to be taken to avoid tax evasion and bring more people into the tax net, and ensure that necessary action is taken to track some of these aspects. But one of the things I want to highlight here, particularly looking at what your question on whether the tax evasion has been addressed, the reintroduction of withholding taxes, right? That means the tax is collected as the payment is made. The payer will be deducting the tax, and before the receiver gets it, and then that amount will be paid to the Indian Revenue. Similarly, what we call this pay-as-you-earn system, pay system for employees, is and has been brought back. These were withdrawn or taken out in 2020, which I think led to significant tax evasion. But now the introduction of this will bring back better collection and quicker collection to the Indian Revenue coffers, which I think will be important. So introduction of withholding taxes and pay system back into a mandatory scheme will definitely help to manage tax evasion to a large extent. But again, as I said before, we need to broad base this more and have technology brought in a bigger way to connect the different systems, etc., so that a more longer term view can be taken to this. And probably these in the interim budget may not be the time for it. It may probably be appropriate to do that in the November 22 reading of the 2023 budget. I would expect a lot more to be brought in there in this.
How will the removal of tax holidays on new projects from April next year affect our investment prospects?
Yeah, I think the tax holidays have mostly been kind of taken out, and it's very limited scope of tax holidays that were left going forward, and those also probably will be taken out. So the framework of tax holidays probably is something that now, particularly with the IMF program in hand, might be non-existent. It's also important to understand how the tax incentive, because the idea of tax holiday or tax incentive is to provide an incentive to an investor to make an investment to make the country competitive, or country look competitive, or to attract investment into areas which government policy prioritizes, right? So in that context, sometimes the tax holidays may not cover it in that form, but as an alternative, how it could be handled is to look at what we call expense-based tax relief, which in other words, what you do is you give a double deduction for certain types of expenses. We have few examples like that have been already there, and is continuing. Example is for research and development expenditure. Now, if you're spending on research and development side of things, you get a double deduction. So that is, you can deduct, if you spend 100, you can deduct 200 when you arrive at your taxable profits. Now, what that means is that if I'll be more interested to look at research and development because I get some tax benefits as well. So it's kind of similar to a tax incentive that you get to a tax holiday, but it's more focused, and it can be more directed to the areas where you want to actually get things going. So I think it's important to focus on this area a little more. I didn't see too many of new expense-based tax reliefs coming in this interim budget, but I hope that there will be areas identified, prioritized areas identified where the investments should be attracted, and that can be probably looked at again in the next budget when it's for the 2023 budget, when it's ready in November 2022, in another few months.
It will be mandatory for all residents over 18 years to register for tax. Is this necessary, and how will it be implemented?
That's an interesting one, because I think the challenge here is how do we really look at it from the number, the volume of tax people who will register for taxes, because already we are struggling to get people into the tax net and manage it. So anyone who's above 18 registering for tax means, I think the objective of that statement or that reading is to say that will bring everybody above 18 years to the tax system or to the tax registration, and you will have a tax number, registration number, which might be probably connected to your ID number or something like that. Now that's good, because that way the Inland Revenue will have a track of every individual, but that doesn't mean that you will be asked to file your tax returns just as you cross 18 years. If you will be asked to file your tax returns only if you have a taxable income and you are supposed to pay taxes. That's how I think we've been made to understand this provision. But having said that, I think the bigger challenge will be how will the technology, particularly the RAMIS system, do this in a manner that it won't complicate things more in the tax administration world, because suddenly you will find 16 million people or 17 million tax registrations coming in just to have a number. But just having a number may not be solving the problem unless you have the next level of tracking available, like what I said before, in terms of connecting the different systems to bring about the digital platforms of integrating things together. So that's something that need to be looked at, because I still believe that that's something that need to be considered more in detail in the next budget, and look at how it can be brought into context, because this is just probably a start and an initial working, but how this can be brought into effective administration need to be detailed out with better and a detailed thought process.
What impact will the new proposals on betting and gaming have on tax revenue?
I don't see it as a big issue at the moment, because I don't think there are many major changes that have been made in that context, other than the licensing and some of the other fees that are being spoken about. But the tax rates per se remain still at the 40% level. I think this is probably an industry which is relatively price inelastic. In other words, you increase the tax rates, people still will keep doing it, right? Hardly those who do it will do it. So I think in that context, these are type of things that generally the governments go after and try to collect their taxes. So by not only in Sri Lanka but everywhere else, these are famous areas like the cigarettes and to the tobaccos and even the liquor. So similar type of approach has been taken. So I really don't think that it's going to have a major impact, and there might be some improvement in the revenue levels, which is also not going to be a big amount. But then, of course, it's not a big issue in my opinion.
Is the aim to reduce public sector debt from 110% of GDP to 100% in the medium term realistic?
That's an interesting one, because you see, we have seen be setting targets onto the debt to GDP, and most of the time what happens is it really goes into a different tangent, particularly when the budget deficit is not in line with what was forecasted in a budget or what was planned. And most of the time you exceed your deficit more than what you plan. So as a result of that, you end up funding it with various means and ending up pushing up the debt to GDP ratios, which have now got into levels of way too high. So I think we have no choice. We have to bring it down. But only question is whether we can do it in those timelines that have been set to get to the 100% level of debt to GDP. Because you see, you're talking about debt, total government debt divided by the size of the economy, or GDP, right? GDP is the size of the economy. So essentially what that means is that both those parameters need to be looked at. Now, we know for sure that this year there will be a negative economic growth, and chances are next year as well, there might be some level of negative growth in the economy. So when your economy grows negatively, your GDP comes down in value, and that means that to arrive at that debt to GDP ratio, you need to bring that absolute debt number even at a faster rate. So that's the challenge, and I think the growth forecast will be quite critical to look at how it will kind of get into a point. But either way, we will have to have realistic targets and start moving towards those targets in a more organized way, with a medium-term policy or a long-term policy, rather than just taking short-term changes to the equation. Now, one of the things that we can clearly see in this equation is that domestic borrowings is the primary source of borrowing that's been used to fund the budget deficit in this interim budget. But it was the case even in the 2022 original budget as well. And for the last couple of years, it has been the case, because we had not had proper debt sustainability to justify and go to the foreign debt holders and get debt other than probably some form of a help type of debt, which we got from India, for example, recently. So in that context, it will be quite a challenging environment, because we have on one side the debt restructuring program. We have kept on hold all our debt payments, and we are going through a debt restructuring program, which is hopefully planned to close in the next 6 months with some form of understanding of how it should be done. So in that light, the way I see it is that the composition of the foreign debt and the domestic debt need to be managed very carefully in that context. And obviously the increase in the domestic debt is at the moment looks a little bit okay, because the depreciation in the currency has made the foreign debt look more expensive in the hands of when you look at it in rupee terms. So I think overall this will be one of the biggest challenges that the government, the finance ministry, will go through in the next 6 to 12 months in structuring and getting a platform that will lead to some realistic debt to GDP ratios to be achieved in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's something that we cannot rush in the short term and try to put a number into it and say, hey, this is what we're going to do, drive to. But instead, it has to be a more realistic number that we need to drive. Otherwise, we can probably create wrong behavior cutting across the whole economy. So it's an important parameter to look at in the next 6 months with this debt restructuring programs going. And I think the IMF program will play a vital role on how that need to be structured and done. And I think we have experts like the Lazads who are doing the debt restructuring program, who will also look at as financial advisors and advise the government on how that need to be structured for the medium to long term.
While sharing your perspective on how the recently proposed interim budget is, you also explain clearly its implications on the economy and the people. Thank you, Hasitha.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And that's all from us tonight. Good night.
Good night.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.